So the very unfortunate crisis in the Ukraine continues to unfold. Instances of racism are disclosing a divide between Ukrainian nationals and non-Ukrainian nationals in search of shelter. Historian Dr. Matthew Quest zooms in now to shed some light on the historical context behind this. Morning, sir. Welcome to Smile Jamaica. It's morning time. How are you, sir?
Hi, good morning, everyone. I'm fine, thank you. Thank you for welcoming me.
Yeah, it's our pleasure. We have some students in Ukraine. I don't think any more are there now because they were able to leave. Black Jamaican students, and I haven't heard anything racism in their regard. Is there a history of racism in the Ukraine?
Well, there is a history and presence of white racial nationalism and fascism in the Ukraine, at least going back 100 years. But the same presence exists in Russia across the border as well.
So tell us, Doc, of course, the conflict has heightened certain social issues and inequalities. What we have been hearing is that since then, the racial inequalities have increased and issues of racism. How true is that?
Well, I think that anytime that there are a bunch of historical circumstances or contemporary circumstances clashing, fascism is has a possibility of increasing. Right now, with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we have an overlapping situation of imperialist war, civil war, an attempt at a war for national liberation of the Ukraine. Of course, there are forces that are more democratic than others.
Right.
Some might be fighting for a new society as they push through this, the presence of fascist tendencies. And this is quite normal in the history of Russia and Eastern Europe, but really all over the world when there's a chaotic situation like this. And I'm aware that recently the Jamaican students who had the experiences of being refugees trying to flee and facing white racism, not just in Ukraine, but in the borderlands near Poland. Obviously, folks were very traumatized and burdened by that. And that is what's bringing the questions to the fore as to, does Ukraine or Russia and Eastern Europe have a unique racial character? And I would say that every nation has conflicting tendencies. There's always a fascist potential, but there's also a democratic and cosmopolitan potential that historically has also been in Russia, Ukraine, and the surrounding Eastern Europe.
Yeah.
And that's consistent, by the way, with Caribbean intellectual history, people being aware of this late into the 20th century. I don't know if you'd like to talk a little bit about that, but I think that's important as well.
Yeah. Who is a fascist?
What is a fascist?
Yeah.
A fascist, well, there are many different historical definitions of fascism. Some people say fascism emerges when capitalism is in decay. Other people say fascism has a particular concern to promote white racial nationalism, or a religious right repressive attitude, an authoritarian state with a focus on terrorizing perceived minorities and outsiders to the main currents of the nation. The fascist philosophy tends to pursue that. And while we're aware that Klan or Nazis can emphasize a white racial nationalism, it doesn't always have to emphasize a white racial nationalism.
Yeah.
Okay.
Because over the years, Doc, we have, I think, enjoyed great diplomatic agreements with Russia. We've had many Jamaican students who have gone there and who have received scholarships for the arts, for sciences, for various areas. And so on the face of it, one would think, okay, but if you've opened your society to a kind of cultural pluralism, why? Why do we still have those seemingly extremely fascist kinds of thoughts existing?
Well, I mean, I think whether we look comparatively at Russia and Eastern Europe or the United States, France, or Britain, no nation has one singular national identity. There are always people working for an ethnically and culturally plural society. And then there are people that have exclusive nativist national identities that resent immigrants, that resent outsiders, that seek to degrade and burden people of color. So that conflicting tendency is always there. And you're right, ma'am, that Jamaica and the Caribbean and the African world have a long-term experience of migrating to Russia and Eastern Europe for school, for cultural exchange, and people have had positive experiences in Russia and Eastern Europe, but they also have had historical experiences where they were treated as outsiders, where they were subjected to racial discrimination. And this tension has always been there in people's experience when they migrated to the area.
Yes.
We spoke, or you mentioned the fact that it's not only Ukraine and Russia, but some of the border countries. So having said that, which countries in Europe, with your expertise, would be more likely to accept Jamaican refugees, African refugees? Which countries in Europe would be more likely to do that?
It's hard for me to say, given my expertise. I'm not really a scholar of refugee resettlement, but I would say that one of the things we have to keep in mind with refugee resettlement or immigration, broadly speaking, is that nation states and ruling elites choose to admit migrants or refugees with their own interests in mind. Can they fulfill certain labor needs? Can they fulfill certain technical or scientific or professional needs? And at the same time, when they admit new populations into their countries, they often don't educate their country about, say, the history of oppression that people have faced in the African world, but even within the countries that they're admitting people into. And so this contributes to ethnic myths, ethnic tension, anxiety about who will be permitted to make a living when new populations come in. And that's in that kind of context, I think that any country can be a potentially dangerous one for someone to migrate to, although each migrant population might be given relatively more privileges than others.
We look back at previous wars, and there was a time, a horrible time, where, Adolf Hitler was also driven by the idea of racial supremacy, religious supremacy, and it manifested itself in this kind of war. Let's contextualize this Russia-Ukraine, although many can see it as a civil war. They were all the Eastern Bloc at one point in time. Is racial supremacy a big part of this current conflict?
It's hard to say. When you say it's a big part, we don't want to minimize it because we just had Jamaican students present who experienced racial abuse.
Right.
So I don't want to minimize it, but if you're asking me, is this the motivation for the conflict? We can read about many motivations. There are economic motivations, struggles for oil, struggles for water, struggles for land. Some people say that the Russians are testing out their new military technology while using up their old military technology. But if we go back over the 20th century, going back 100 years, we need to remember that Ukraine is part of the historical countries that greater Russian imperialism conquered.
Correct.
And that even after the Bolshevik Revolution, they still had the problem of, like, as you suggested, what's called the Eastern Bloc, but conquered Eastern European nations. Ukraine was the first country to lead a major national liberation movement against Bolshevik Russia, and was led by a movement that led by Nestor Makhno, that led a movement for workplace councils and popular assemblies. And this was clashing with the Bolshevik state. Then there was a famous Treaty of Brest-Litovsk where Russia, making peace with the Western powers, basically traded away Ukraine to the other imperialists. So this might seem like a mouthful, but what we want our audience to understand is Ukraine has a long history of being a colonized people by Russia. This is only the latest installment of Russian aggression, in that a movement for national liberation can have great radical democratic content, but it can also have aspects of a right-wing fascist resentment. And both those conflicting tendencies are present in Ukraine at this time. You know?
Yeah. Final question, Dr. Matthew. War is never good, and people are losing lives and family members and stuff. What we are speaking about, can anything good come out of this?
Oh, I think a lot of good could come out of it, even though we don't want to minimize, the mothers that lose children and their pain. I think historically, as recently as 1968 to 69, an international conflict in Montreal about racism that treated Caribbean immigrant students badly abroad in Montreal ended up being a stimulus for a great radical democratic social motion in Jamaica, Trinidad, Grenada, and across the region. So what I'm hopeful of is that the Jamaican students that were burdened by what they found in Eastern Europe will come back to the Caribbean with a great global consciousness, a great sense of possibility, and maybe that will stimulate a struggle for democratic accountability in their own nation.
Yep.
That has happened before.
Yep.
And so we hope that it can happen again.
Thank you for speaking with us, sir. Stay safe. God bless you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, ma'am.
Historian Dr. Matthew Quest sharing with us on the issue of racial divide in the Ukraine. Vaccines for the deaf? We're going to hear about an exciting new campaign